Welcome to this episode of the Classical U podcast. I'm excited today to be talking with Junius Johnson. He's in our studios recording a couple of new courses for Classical U with us that we're very excited about, as well as a forthcoming book with our imprint Classical U Books. The book is on teaching fairy stories, and that's the conversation that we're having today. Junius is a speaker, educator, consultant at juniusjohnson.com. And welcome, Junius. In our first conversation together into the topic of the imagination a good bit, and I'd love to jump in there and kind of indulge and get a little bit maybe nerdy together. I don't know what the right word is, but the topic of fairy and the imagination is something that I get excited about, so we'll probably, overindulge. But hey, we're just going to do it. So, one of the things we talked about this week during some of our lunches that is, certainly going to be continuing to, I'll be continuing to mull over it in my own mind, but the relationship between the fall of humanity and the realm of fairy, I love how you talk about that. And you and I found that we agreed on, kind of arcane theological point that the physical laws of entropy are a result of the human fall. Not every Christian certainly would, come to that, would agree with that. But if the fall is sort of that basic of a feature of our world, how does the world of fairy relate and provide us with a way of seeing reality, an unfallen reality in a sense? How does the realm of fairy help with that vision that we can get very, I think, just make the assumption that this world is all that there is, that the law of entropy is sort of a God-given reality. And if we take that assumption away, there's radical implications of, well, what is real? And we need the imagination then. So anyway, the relationship between fairy and paradise.
Yeah. I guess gosh, it's such a rich topic, as we've already discovered, and I've got new thoughts even just hearing you talk about it right now. So I'm going to start somewhere different than where I started when we talked about this at lunch. Where I'm going to start, I think, is here. In many of the traditions, in some ways, in every one of the fairy traditions, although in some corners you could dispute it, and I won't get that technical. The standard line is that the fairy realm, which Tolkien uses the older appellation for it, is the realm perilous, which I love. The realm perilous is older than ours. The fairies may be fallen angels. They may be the remnants of the old gods and powers who were around before. Maybe they were part of the chaos out of which that was chastened to make space for our creation. I feel like that's actually the one that dominates most versions of the stories. Is the fairies are these older powers that they just have their own thing going on, and they're not fundamentally hostile or friendly to humans because they aren't fundamentally oriented to us at all. They're pursuing their own history. If there's a fairy Bible, we have no idea what its contents are, what their sacred history would be, or even their secular history. It's one of the things that makes them dangerous to humans is because their reactions to us are so unpredictable and their ways of thinking are so different to ours. They fit in this group of folks that Lewis describes in The Discarded Image as the longairi, right? Those who are the long-lived. And often there's a sense of de-eternity, everlastingness about fairies. So taking that as a starting point, that obviously suggests a notion of the realm perilous as a realm that predates the entire realm of human history, and therefore that is earlier than the fall. And if it's not ordered to the human realm, then it also would not be subject to fall with us in the same way that the material creation that is ordered to humans as their vice-regent was subject and does groan along with us in that fall. And so maybe one of the reasons why the laws of fairyland differ so greatly from the laws of our world is because they're marching to a different drum, and possibly an unfallen drum. Now, that said, I want to slice across that with an entirely different notion, which is that's speaking of fairyland, that's taking fairyland on its own terms as if the ways that it's presented in the tradition are actually in the real world true of it. Now let's come at it as an invention of human minds, which really I think means an invention of God's mind set in the world for humans to rediscover. It's the glory of God to hide a things, but the glory of kings is to search them out. So then what fairyland turns into, and you'll see very clearly, G.K. Chesterton speaks very clearly about it in this way in the Ethics of Elfland. He says, it's not earth that judges heaven, it's heaven that judges earth. It's not the real world that judges fairyland, it's fairyland that judges the real world. Fairyland exists to hold up a mirror to reality, but it's a funhouse mirror. It's a mirror that distorts. But as Chesterton says in his novel, The Man Who Was Thursday, he's talking about disguises. He says, these disguises didn't disguise, but revealed. These distortions of fairyland don't distort reality. They de-distort it back into its true form so we can actually see it properly. Which means in fairyland, we'll see both the reflection of something of the unfallen character of our world, but we also have to see the reflection of the fallen character of our world. It's perilous to us both because in fairyland, everything is magnified. And so our sin and the results of our sin are magnified in fairyland. That's why so many of the fairy stories hinge around this very tiny prohibition, right? You can live forever in happiness with the princess as long as you don't show her an onion, right? It's seemingly weird, random, irrelevant condition. Is kind of like just saying, you can live forever in joy and paradise as long as you don't eat that apple. Right? There's a strong connection there. Everything is magnified. Everything is blown up. And so when you look at something like George MacDonald's Phantastes, where Anodos goes through and commits these seemingly small transgressions that have these massive consequences for himself and for others. And there's a great deal of damage around himself as he goes through fairyland transgressing. That's a part of the peril of it. The other part of the peril of it, though, is that it, in being in many ways good itself, like Aslan, who is good but not safe, good things aren't safe for us because we aren't good yet. And so fairyland, if it turns the world on its head, and it does so in order to present the world more rightly to men who have turned themselves on their heads. Homo curvatus in se, as Augustine says, man twisted in upon himself. So you're not seeing the world well. You're upside down. So we're going to flip it upside down so you can begin to see it well again. So I think there's all of these dynamics running through fairyland where it's able to be a mirror of the world that was, the world that could have been, the world that is, and in some ways even the world that may be, all in one.
So I've read a little bit about fairy sort of. There's multiple ways that it gets talked about, and you can, and you've brought a few of those up just now in a very rich, layered answer. But I think the kind of world of archetypes, the symbolic world, is one way that it's talked about, kind of Jungian categories maybe, and you've got an almost historical or anthropological approach. What are some of the categories that you find most helpful? You talked about the approach of this is something in the human imagination versus this is something real in its own right. I think some of the ways of thinking about this, though, could even put those two things not at odds with each other. The human imagination is engaged with realities that transcend this fallen world, and therefore, in some way, it's both a product of the human imagination and in touch with higher, deeper, realities. But I guess what I'm asking, I'm wandering a bit here. But I'm curious what realms of discourse, like what almost academic disciplines you found helpful in engaging this whole topic. because you can come at it, as a theologian, maybe through psychology, through history or metaphysics. What's helpful?
Yeah. For me personally, philosophy, theology, and I was going to say literature, but I'm going to say poetics instead, which I think has a different connotation and brings a bit more to the table than just saying literature would, because I include in that poetic modes of discourse, ways of talking about it. We spoke in the last podcast about starting my classes with these beautiful prose passages to inflame the student's heart, that kind of thing. So the Ethics of Elfland, I would say, is a poetic approach to talking about fairyland. Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the things that people want to know when I start talking about fairies and dragons is, do you think these things are real? And the best response to them is, what do you mean by real? Because a really important thing that I think Jesus worked really hard to try to teach us this, and I don't think we've learned the lesson very well. Thoughts are real. The reason it's true that if you even look at a woman with lust in your heart, you have committed adultery with her, is because your thoughts are real things. They are actual deeds for which you will be held accountable on Judgment Day. If that's true, then the products of our imagination are real. Now, there's different modalities of the real, and things that are within the mind have a type of reality that is different than things that are outside the mind do. I can pick up things outside the mind. Well, not all things. Only physical things outside the mind I can pick up, not so much the other way. That doesn't mean they're less real, right? To be non-physical is not necessarily to be less real. It's just to be differently real. And I think that's another move that's very hard for us to make this side of so much materialism and physicalism, is to not fall into the trap of thinking that concrete means physical when it doesn't necessarily. So if that's the case, the products of our imagination are real, and they're really doing things to us, and they're really doing things to the world, even if there's no such thing as a fairy outside of my mind. That said, you spoke of archetypes, you spoke of a bit of some of these, getting in touch with other things. I do think that the things that we embody in our imaginations, the things that we embody in fairies and unicorns and dragons, are real dynamics and principles and forces in the world. And so they don't exist in the way in which we imagine them in the world, I wouldn't say, but they're not any less the less real for that. They're not any the less in the world for that. And so, people acted differently in their lives for centuries because they believed, and still do, because they believed that there were literally fairies, and if they didn't do certain things, certain consequences would happen. Some of that falls under superstition. You can see horseshoes nailed above barns all over Europe because the iron keeps the fairies from entering and, souring the milk of the cow or stealing the cow's milk or whatever else. But some of those were to do with prudent action in the world, with care for one another and for the community. Where the realm perilous, you ever notice how many fairy stories, not just fairy tales, but fairy stories, have a moral, right? They're trying to move you to understand the world rightly. And so because of that, you've got this way of, it's a mode of passing on wisdom. So for me personally, I tend to come at wisdom through philosophy. I tend to come at it through theology. I tend to come at it through this poetic form of discourse. I'm less given to psychology in every imaginable way of thinking about that. But nevertheless, I am interested in what sort of philosophical psychology, which is, what account do we give of the human soul and of its contents? And it very much belongs to philosophy, and even more so to theology, to deal with the desires and the fears and the hopes and the dreams of the human heart. And so I would bring those things under that sort of an umbrella as well.
The question of what's real is often, I think, stirred up and made more challenging when, as Christians, we start talking about in relation to the kingdom of God. And one of the fun conversations I enjoyed with you was talking about animals and, animals in heaven. And, can you describe the history of Christian thought on that topic? And you and I both were willing to say that animals may in fact participate in the transfiguring, resurrection, the transfiguration of this world into, the world of God's kingdom, as particular animals. But what's the history of Christian thought on that topic, and how would you articulate where you might think it's appropriate to go, on that issue?
Yeah, it's been it's been difficult for the church to think about anything like individual animal immortality because of the philosophical milieu in which Christianity arose. Um, Certainly, for Aristotle, particulars don't survive their dissolution, and so the notion of reconstitution of a destroyed particular doesn't work for Aristotle. Even on a really strict Aristotelian metaphysic, when my body dies, and then some unspecified amount of time later, I'm subject to the resurrection of the dead, Aristotle would say it's not the same body. Even if I get all the same atoms back, it's not the same body because it's been destroyed. The form has gone. And so, but also for Plato, Plato does not have a lot of space for affirming the physical material world. Not material. Material is actually anachronistic for Plato. That's Aristotle's term. But the physical world, everything about the physical world, including human bodies, is directed to the world of the forms, and it's a declination away from the world of the forms, and it's to be overcome in the return to the world of the forms. And that's why Platonic philosophy, is detachment from the physical in order to reattach yourself to the forms. So, this joins with the native Christian idea about not being wed to this world, not being being in the world but not of it, leaving this world, dying to self. The world will be overturned in fire and all these other sorts of things. And so it kind of feels like, yeah, this is one of the things Plato and Aristotle were getting right, But there's that pesky doctrine of the resurrection of the body. If the body is going to be raised as a physical thing, it belongs to physical things to be in physical contexts. Or to put it differently, bodies need worlds. And so we have the doctrine of a new heavens and a new earth. Heaven itself being a creation, a new heavens, a new sky, not a new glorious afterlife. And then that amazing moment of revelation when the city of Jerusalem comes down to rest on earth. And so the last biblical image we get of bliss, of the blessed life of life after death, is not of ascending to God, to some heaven above, but of God coming down here in a city that needs no temple because the Lamb himself is its temple, right? That all combines to make an image of a new physical world populated by physical things. And so then one can ask the question of identity. Is it this world transformed, or is this world destroyed and a new world is made? Well, you can start casting out scriptures, right? Behold, I make all things new, but now I'm going to cast away the old world like a garment and whatnot. And it doesn't really answer your question very well. But what it leads me to think about is this question of the results of the fall. And what's right, what makes sense for God to do as a result of the fall. So by the time we get to someone like Bonaventure in the 13th century, and he's not unique in saying this, a way that they have tried to sort of synthesize these different streams is to say, well, animals, particular animals, pets, right? They'll live on with us in heaven because we'll remember them. And so great will be the power of our thoughts that it will be as if they were with us. But their immortality is according to a different mode than the existence that is proper to them as creatures. Namely, it's non-physical. My dog lives on in my mind. My cat lives on in my mind, not as something that I could interact with and play with and that sort of a thing. But I got to think, and so for a long time, and also, another thing that contributes to this is the fact that rationality is the thing that has been valued, right? What makes someone a person, Boethius says, a person is an individual substance of a rational nature. Animals lack rational souls, and so they're not susceptible of salvation. They're not susceptible of ongoing things. Human souls last forever. Animal souls are destroyed with the destruction of the animal. So for a long time, I thought, well, animals can't be saved. Animals won't show up in their particularities in the afterlife because that's not the type of thing that animals are. But then I began to think, if we take seriously this notion that the nature of reality was changed at the fall, and it doesn't matter for this purpose whether you think the fall was a historical event or whether you think that it is a theological reality that corresponds to no particular thing. The bottom line is, if reality is otherwise than it would have been because of human sin, then the original conception of animals would have been immortality because there was no death. Death is a consequence of sin. It seems strange. Animals, they're subject to groaning. They're subjected to futility and human sin along with the rest of creation, but it is not through any sin or fault of their own. It seems weird for an animal that was originally meant to live forever to not live forever because of human sin, an external sin, right? When even humans who sin will live forever. So that can begin to push me in the other direction. And there's this notion that God doesn't waste anything. And the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable and these sorts of things. And as far as I and my limited human understanding can judge, when I very much want to underscore this is pure speculation based upon my limited understanding, it seems that it would be more just for particular animals to see some sort of restoration in that final kingdom of God than for them not to, in terms of the restoration of the original divine purposes for those animals as animals.
You do seem to have, in a whole scriptural tradition, Jewish and Christian scriptures, this preponderance of, all of creation kind of hanging together. It's all, clapping its hands and shouting and praising God. It's all groaning. There's this sense that, from the mountains and the rivers to the beasts and birds of the field, we're all in something in a certain regard together. We're all in it together. There's also, recognition of different modes of life, but yeah, I think that image that you referred to of heaven coming down, God coming to us, very Emmanuel and incarnational. That's a transfiguring of our entire history, our entire cosmos, lines up well, with scripture, so that in a certain regard, death and so many characteristics of this cosmos are tossed aside like a garment, but also everything is made new, at the same time.
That's right. Because a cosmos without entropy would be very different than the cosmos we know.
Yeah.
But it would not necessarily have to be numerically different to the cosmos we know.
Yeah.
And then for the first time we could really see it.
Yeah.
Because we'd see it in its true form.
Yeah. So, we're obviously and in an entirely speculative mode and realm, not talking about doctrine, but just talking about theologomenon or matters of opinion. But yeah, I've felt that way increasingly myself. That what really lines up with Scripture is that particular animals, and getting into the question of. You had talked at the beginning of, when you were in the mode of talking about the realm of fairy as something, either prior to, if you want to use temporal terms, or I would say maybe, beyond or within, deeper than or outside of our realm, with its own kind of story and issues, maybe its own kind of fallenness or lack of fall in various respects, maybe both of those things. But that would then come in potentially to something that we're ultimately able to engage with in our resurrected bodies, our spiritual embodiment. That we would then not only bring sort of animal and plant life and the mountains and streams and hills and valleys and oceans of this world, but all of that would come into participation with in a more complete sense, something that is real, that now we engage with through our hearts and minds, and imaginations, as products of our own longings and thoughts, but that may have a reality in its own right.
Yeah, that's interesting. If there turns out to be a real fairyland out there somewhere, then God, who is reconciling all things, part of what the reconciling might look like is bringing these realms that have only tangentially touched one another into full contact with one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I love to have that hope, I suppose you could put it that way. We also talked a little bit, and this is related, but I think maybe anyone who's still listening to us might be relieved to hear that we would draw the line somewhere, which is fictional characters. I loved an old essay by Joshua Gibbs, First Thursday Institute, on his delightful blog that for many years, but a long time ago, maybe close to a decade, about fictional characters in heaven, and he makes quite a robust case for it. But it is there. I think it's more along the lines of like what you were describing with Bonaventure. That we would remember our animals, but a sense in which we will remember the fictional characters that we love, and they'll have a part, a kind of reality in our lives together. Imagine an eternity with Tolkien, you loving Aragorn, Tolkien loving Aragorn, me loving Aragorn, and what does that mean? So there's a kind of a real place, but nonetheless, Aragorn is not, a spiritual embodiment alongside of us, as we are claiming maybe our dogs might be. But anyway, thoughts on kind of fictional characters and the difference there.
Yeah, this all kind of started when Jesse and I were talking, and I was reporting him that my son picked up the idea, I don't know if it was from my daughter or somewhere else, that the real Paw Patrol would be in heaven. And so then he's been saying that he wants to die because he wants to meet the real Paw Patrol. Keeping a very close eye on that one. There's a distinction to be made, right? Because what we're talking about here, what for me at least is underlying my choices in these speculative matters is a sense of justice and a sense of wisdom, right? That I believe that God will act justly and wisely. And I know that if I'm wrong, whatever God is going to do is going to be more just and more wise than what I thought of. And even if I'm right, what God does is going to be more just and more wise than the way that I thought of it. So, there's no doubt about that. So for me, justice means that my cat, who has an existence outside of my mind, ought to have an existence outside of my mind in the life to come. But Aragorn, who does not have an existence outside of the minds of the people thinking about him, Tolkien and Jesse and Junius, is not required in the same way that he exists outside of our minds, because if he exists only in our minds there, that would be in good proportion to the way that he exists here. However, two things are really, really different in the life to come that could have major implications for Aragorn's existence there without giving him extra mental, spiritual, embodied existence. The first is our minds are going to work so much better, right? Our minds work really badly right now. And I say this as someone who lives the life of the mind and make money on my mind. It sucks. I am at cross purposes with myself all the time because of my sin. My sin causes me to undercut myself. It causes me to work against myself. It blinds me to things that I otherwise ought to see. The world isn't the way that it is. I can't perceive the world as well. In very profound ways, how we perceive the world is not determined, but it's very affected by what we think and what we believe and what we hold on to in our hearts. And so with all of that intellectual faculty, polished up, the dirt gotten off, and supercharged by union and participation in the divine life, my imaginings of Aragorn will be more robust to such an extent that it may approach a qualitative rather than a quantitative difference. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we're under the curse of Babel. Right? There's a divine curse on human language and really on all human communication, if you take language broadly, that is intended to keep us from being able to fully unburden ourselves to one another, to fully make ourselves known to one another. It's one of the reasons why when you read that passage about then we shall know fully even as we are fully known, it is so heart-achingly wonderful because we know we're not fully known here by anybody we meet, right? That's going to be gone in the new heavens and the new earth. The things Tolkien was trying to tell us about Aragorn that he was not able to because of the limitations of art and language, he will be able to tell us. The things that he in no way intended, but that are part of my understanding of Aragorn, I will be able to fully communicate to you. And so the Tolkien fan club in heaven gets together and we talk about Aragorn, and every single person brings a new aspect of this character that's really true and that can truly be communicated. And we come away with this way richer understanding of him as a result of that true communication. I think those two things together give Aragorn a supercharged possibility in heaven that exceeds anything we can imagine here, without giving him the same sort of existence as a person in heaven as Jesse will have, or as Saint Teresa will have, or what have you.
So there may be hope for your son's, dreams of a Paw Patrol fan club.
That's right. That's right. He may not shake hands with Chase and Marshall, and yet the ways that he's able to commune with these characters there will be deeply satisfying to him in exactly the way not exactly the way he desires, but in a way that satisfies exactly what he longs for, to an extent that he doesn't know how to long for.
I'm wondering how many people just tuned out when we brought up the Tolkien fan club in heaven, but or tuned in. So. There's an image in C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves where he's describing, it's this heartbreakingly beautiful passage. He's talking about the loss of Tolkien, I think, as a friend because of death, and using that to talk about friendship. But he draws this picture with his words of, the beatific vision, everyone gathered around God in eternity, paradise, delighting in God's presence, delighting in God's goodness and beauty and love directly. But then he says, we're in a circle, and we're all growing infinitely in our capacity to receive and enjoy and return thanks for God's love, to behold that together. But we're helped by each other in that. And he says, I'm going to see sort of out of the corner of my eyes the delight on the face, I think he's primarily focusing on language of vision, but if we were to add in music, which I know is near and dear to your heart, and we imagine ourselves, not only radiating delight with our facial expressions, but singing together and all of that, making art together. And and I'm going to see out of the corner of my eyes, as it were, the way in which you're responding to God. And that's going to help me to see something about the God that I'm loving and delighting in that I was not seeing before. And that's just this mutual escalation, of infinite.
I'm going to take Lewis one step further on that. But before I do, I'm going to point out that, in this life, because we're never, barring some sort of miraculous divine intervention that may or may not have ever been used in the past, we're not ever going to be rid of our sin. Our sanctification is an asymptotic approach to the point of being sanctified. But the growth that we experience in heaven is not asymptotic, because there's not a fixed point that we're ever more incrementally approaching. The fixed point is removed, and now we can grow unboundedly forever, because there's no limit to what that can look like. And that fully exceeds human conception. Lewis is starting there from Augustine's notion that in heaven, we don't need to look at one another. We'll look at God, and we'll see everyone else through God as they are prototypically imaged forth in the Son. Bonaventure then moves a step beyond Augustine, and he says he has this image in a book of his called the Soliloquy, that heaven is like a banquet, a progressive banquet. And so tonight, the banquet is at Jesse's house in heaven. I go to prepare a room for you. And Jesse is going to be making, what's a food you really love?
Jiaozi's. It's a pork dumpling.
Yeah, gyota. Okay, so
maybe not with pigs.
So he's gonna make these pork dumplings. Why not? Pigs taste amazing. Those are not gonna go away. So he's gonna make them, which I can now hear. I've been pronouncing incorrectly all my life, and I trust Jesse's pronunciation.
Well, that's the Taiwanese. You have a good Mandarin.
Oh, well, great. Thank you for that. So he's making, these are the little Asian dumplings. You guys know what they are. He's going to make those. And here's the thing. He's the only person in heaven who makes them, because he was created by God with a special understanding of them, such that he could make them in the best imaginable way, which it turns out is not one single imaginable way. And we'll see that in a second. So we'll go there and we'll eat of these. And it's like, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. Tomorrow night, you're coming over to my house. And in my house, I'm serving donuts. And I'm the only guy who makes donuts, and I make the best donuts there are. And here's the interesting point. My donuts are informed by what I tasted in your dumplings. And so now I make my donuts a little bit differently. And we go through all of heaven with everyone making their dishes for each other. And then it gets back around to you again. And when you make your dumplings the second time, they're even better because they've been enriched by everybody else's food you've tasted along the way. And that just goes on and on around for eternity. And by the way, the angels are part of this too. It's not just the humans who are doing this. And what he means by that, what's the food? If this is an analogy.
Does Bonaventure use food?
He does,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Isn't it great?
Yeah.
The food is our understanding of God, that we're being enriched from one another's vision of God. And I think that's really, really beautiful. Now, because I think that each creature is made to be a specific, unique, and unrepeatable image of God, to declare God in a unique way that only it of all creatures can do, and I mean that as much for cockroaches as I do for persons, then I think that there's this powerful way in which when we look at something and we see it most truly and we see to the heart of what it is.
You just brought cockroaches into the beatific vision.
I did bring
All right,
cockroaches
continue.
in. Yep. Because as much as I may not like them, right, our Creator is good and the works of God are very good. So when I see you most truly, what I see is the particular way in which you image God, and that sets off what Bonaventure calls a contuition, where I see you, and by seeing you, not along with seeing you, not instead of seeing you, but by seeing you, very incarnational, I also see God. And I see God in a way I could not see him anywhere other than in you. Well, this grounds, and now I'm going beyond Bonaventure, and now we're into Junius, this grounds the claim that we will not only gaze upon God in himself in heaven, I will also turn to you in heaven and gaze upon God in you. But, and this is the trick, Augustine was concerned about, he's a Platonist, and for Plato, you're contemplating the forms, and the moment you have a moment of inattention and glance away from the forms anywhere else, you fall. Mm-hmm. And Augustine's worried about that. He wants to lock us into that beatific vision. But the way that I preserve Augustine's concern is turning to you does not require turning from God. Mm-hmm. I'm turning to God in you, and I can really look at you and see God in that way too. And so then that takes us even out. It doesn't have to be the corner of your eye. Yeah. We can actually meet, lock gazes, and all of that beautiful information that can be transferred in the mutual gaze and regarding of one another will be there. And the content of that will both be you being truly known by me, and also me being taught by you about aspects of God that I could only learn if I looked at you.
Mm-hmm. So our sanctification, that kind of line that we cross, that is the capacity to see God, in each other.
That's right. And so the beatific vision is ubiquitous.
Yeah, yeah. To give Lewis as much credit as possible, he is hinting at all of that. I think he's going a little beyond Augustine and some of Augustine's anxieties. Yeah. By at least granting us the corner of our eyes.
I completely agree.
Yeah, and he does that.
And I needed his step to make my step too.
Yeah. I love how you bring it right to locking eyes, and you were talking just a little bit ago about known to be known, and that's that fully knowing. It's just, as you say, it's soul. It's a kind of heart and soul agony to think. We taste it now. We see it. We see it in our loved ones, in our interactions, but we know
it's like it's just out of reach. I can almost.
But that would be something we enjoy together because we see the image of God. And of course, there's just many beautiful examples of this in poetry and literature. Gerard Manley Hopkins, has wonderful Christ plays in 10,000 Places. And Lewis, when you talked about Bonaventure using the food image, which I've got to look that passage up. I'm not. Shame on me. That sounds.
It's pretty obscure.
Yeah. Well, I would love for you to email me that passage. Lewis does end with bread, actually. Yeah. So he ends his little passage in the Four Loves, the sharing of the heavenly bread. The more you taste of the bread, the more, I can't quote him, but he's talking about this infinite expansion and escalation of our enjoyment of the feast together.
Yeah, that's right. And what are we doing in that moment? Like, what's happening is we're each, because we're each priests, we're a royal priesthood, And our priesthood is a participation in the archetypal priesthood of Christ, who's our great high priest in the heavens. And what I'm doing when you come to my house in that analogy, in that banquet analogy, is I'm feeding you from myself. Mm-hmm. And so what do we do but what we see our high priest doing is he feeds us from himself in the Eucharist. However you take that, listeners, whether you think that's a real presence or whether you think that's metaphorical, it's still theologically true that Christ feeds us with himself. Unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you shall not have life within you. And then we do the same thing in our banquet in an analogous way. That means analogous means that it's not exactly the same. It is attuned to the types of being we are. But, what a joy to be converted into the type of thing that can feed my neighbor in his love of God, in her love of God, right? It's just such a powerful image of heaven. I want to say something about heaven while I've got all of you guys captive, and that is this. I have at times in my life been afraid to speculate about heaven because I've been afraid of getting it wrong. And especially I've been afraid of getting attached to an image that I have no right to, and possibly setting myself up for disappointment when I get there. Well, that's silly. It is impossible to be disappointed by heaven. It's heaven. It can't disappoint you, right? So here's the trick. Whatever the thing is that you're expressing, the longing that you're expressing in your desire to fly in heaven or read all the books in heaven or whatever, if heaven doesn't have that thing in the way that you think it does, it will have something that satisfies that desire you have to a deeper and fuller extent than the image you've come up with. So for whatever reason you wish you could fly in heaven, if you can't fly in heaven, there'll be something you can do in heaven that will scratch exactly that itch and be better. I think this means that we should feel free to speculate freely about heaven because I find that when I do so, it increases my imagination, my ability to imagine the goods of heaven, which draws me further on, which becomes an inducement to stay in the course and fighting the good fight. So once again, we have to use our imaginations for our imaginations to grow. Let's even use our imaginations on heaven, always keeping in mind that it is guaranteed to be at least as good as whatever we come up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've been struck as over the course of our conversation that we keep alluding to, sometimes quite directly, earthly relationships, the here and now, each other's faces, our families, meals, homes, and so we're participating now, and that freedom to imagine what it is we're participating in, to grow and expand our imaginal capacity. Is a blessing here and now. It's guiding us. It's giving us moral. It's sort of refining our moral compass, and expanding our loves and our sense of what is the call of justice now. What is the image of God in my neighbor? All of these things. So it's intensely practical and immediate at the same time as, I used to have similar anxieties. Mine were more tied to, am I trying to escape, the here and now, sort of shirk my duties, etc. But I had a kind of similar sequence of realizing, actually when I quote unquote indulge these things, read Harry Potter or whatever, I'm really coming away a better husband, better father, better friend, because it's engaging me in reality now, in a fallen world. So this is just delightful. So many things are coming to mind. Spiritual embodiment, we've used that phrase a little bit. I think it might be helpful to talk about that briefly, but a couple other things come to mind, but let me pitch it back to you. Anything else? We've got maybe, 15 minutes or so before we should wrap this up, but anything over the course of our conversation that you'd want to revisit, define? Spiritual embodiment comes to mind for me, but anything from you?
Well, just to say a big yes and to what you just said there at the end, you talked about how this is, the sort of imagining of heaven and things is very practical because it touches on our lives morally and these are other sorts of ways, and absolute yes to all those things. And on top of that, if you do it with the right spirit, it's also itself an act of worship. It's an act of worshiping God. that's where the contemplative and the active life collapse. The contemplative and the active life collapse around the worship of God, because worship unites both activity and contemplation. And Paul's pray without ceasing is casting forth a vision that increasingly can become real for the believer as they progress in sanctification. That more and more of your activity comes under worship, and more your activity becomes contemplative, and your contemplation becomes activity. I think that's something important I'd want to make sure that folks catch in what we're saying. Mm-hmm. Yeah, spiritual embodiment this is a topic that the American church has done a bad job on for a long time, making sure people understand the full ramifications of the resurrection of the body. And so maybe I'll take it from square one, just because I don't know where people are picking it up. The Christian doctrine is that there will be a general resurrection, which means that everybody, both the saved and the damned, will be returned to their bodies. So what are the implications of that? Well, death is nothing other than the separation of body and soul. Most Christians believe that the soul remains aware after death, and so it's not as if your experience ceases when your soul separates from your body. It just changes to a different type of experience. And that's unnatural. That's called by the scripture and by the tradition unnatural. The natural state of humanity is immortality. There have been a few exceptions to that. Athanasius seems to have thought that we were naturally mortal, but we were created with a grace that made us immortal. And when we fell, God withdrew that grace and returned us to our mortal state. But he's definitely the minority in thinking something like that. Most Christians think we're naturally immortal, and death sin brought this unnatural death upon us. But here's the thing: even unnatural death is temporary. It can't endure. So great is the bond between soul and body that it is bound to be overcome. And we can see that. So then that means that the state of being separated from our bodies is a monstrous one. That would be Aristotle's technical term for it. It's like a three-legged dog. A three-legged dog is monstrous because it's not as it should be. It doesn't conform to the norm. And I think we can see echoes and glimpses in the scriptures of this, that in Revelation, there are all these saints who are hanging out underneath the throne of God. And that might mean just like, the throne is elevated and they're in front of it. But I always have had this image of kind of like Jabba the Hutt. You pull the throne back and there's all these saints under there in this little pit, and they're saying, "How long, O Lord, how long?" And what does the Lord do? He gives them a robe and says, "Just a little longer." Well, the robe is a biblical image of the body. They're clamoring because they want to get their bodies back. They want the general resurrection. They don't feel whole without their bodies. That yes, they're blessed, but they don't have the fullness of blessedness apart from their bodies. Right? So then what this means, to get to the final payoff of all of this, is that our imaginings of heaven need to be intensely physical. Heaven is a place built for creatures with physical bodies. And that means that, the pleasures of the body are going to be there in ways that we can't imagine. Food will be better in heaven than it is now, right? The joy of running. Lewis talks in The Last Battle about this wild joy of running as fast as you can and being able to run faster and faster and run up mountains and whatnot. Whatever is good about the physical body will be there. Bonaventure has this notion. If you can't tell, Bonaventure is my favorite theologian. He has this notion that the body as we know it is not the best possible vessel for the soul. And so the body is going to get a fourfold dowry at the resurrection that will suit it better to be the vehicle of the soul. And that fourfold dowry consists in illumination. And so luminosity, so the body will give off light, which is what enables you to look on my body and see my thoughts and understand what's going on inside of me. It will get invulnerability, impassibility, right? It can no longer be wounded or damaged in any way. And then I love these two. It'll get agility, which is the ability to move at the speed of thought. Right? If you want to go visit Pluto, just think it and you're there because your body can move that quickly. And it'll get subtlety. And subtlety is the ability for two bodies to exist in the same place. Subtlety is what's required for Christ to walk through walls, right? Because he has to be at some point during that process, he's in the same space the wall is in. Right now, bodies are repugnant to each other, but then they won't be repugnant to each other, right? I think that's all quite lovely. And something that we talked about the other day that is very relevant here is if there's a new physics to go along with these new bodies, it's quite possible that we get a glimpse of it in the resurrected body of Christ. That Christ, the resurrected body of Christ, is able to walk through walls and teleport and change its appearance. The Emmaus disciples don't recognize him. Not because he's using divine power to do miraculous things, but because his body brings with it the physics of the next world. And these are all parts of the physics of the next world, right? Luminosity would mean that I could change my external appearance and you would still recognize that it's me, because it's a transparency of who I am through my body. My body perfectly expresses who I am, however it may be externally configured. I would hope that what people are getting out of this conversation is a sense of they could do this all day, right? There's no end to the number of crazy things they can imagine about heaven. Yeah, that's the point, right? We all think we're like Han Solo. We can imagine a lot. But Han Solo couldn't imagine a lot. He does a particularly bad job of imagining what his reward would be. He's thinking money, but he gets a princess. He finds a wife, right? A change in his life. We all need to learn to dream bigger, to imagine bigger, to expand those horizons. And I love this kind of conversation. Thank you for setting this conversation up, because I'm saying things I've never thought before in the context of this conversation. You've got to constantly keep reaching beyond what you've thought to the next thing God wants you to think, and to the next thing, because you can be sure an infinite, omnipotent God has never run out of things to place in front of you to discover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm grateful for someone who is willing to indulge and go there. There's not a lot of people that that will sit and kind of talk comfortably about all of this, because you inevitably indulge in a bit of the ridiculous. As someone I once remember saying, like, every attempt to talk about heavenly life, the beatific vision, what it would actually be like, quote unquote, is going to fall prey to a kind of cartoonish absurdity. It's going to be profoundly ugly in some sense, because we're trying to articulate something that we glimpse, in a glass darkly, as Paul says, or through a veil. I think, again, as Paul says, the veil of death now. So we participate in it, we glimpse it, but we can't really articulate it.
We don't even have the right categories for it,
But I do find it very helpful to stretch and to try a little bit. And you brought up Lewis's image of running at the end of the last battle. That whole book. There's so much in Lewis that's just profoundly helpful here. I think you and I had talked earlier about the Great Divorce. The scenes in heaven where you have both, and it's kind of hard to tell them apart, actually, the angelic beings and the saints in their spiritual embodiment. And Lewis just goes over the top describing spiritual embodiment and how tangible it is, how profoundly concrete. It's more substantive, than I love, reading theological debates and stuff. There's an essay, The Spiritual is More Substantial Than the Material, I think is the title of the essay that David Bentley Hart wrote in a kind of goofy debate that he and N.T. Wright were having over New Testament translations. But I love that essay, arguing that the spiritual is more substantial than the material. And I'm just constantly reminded of Lewis, who I don't think I've ever read. There's some great stuff in George MacDonald, I think it's in Lilith, but a scene that describes this kind of mutual light that's being shared back and forth. And but I don't think I can think of passages that better sort of try to describe spiritual embodiment than C.S. Lewis and like The Great Divorce, and the substantiality of it. But you mentioned in his space trilogy, where I think it is.
Yeah, and Out of the Silent Planet, as they're coming, there's two moments. One is as they're about to land on Malacandra for the first time, and he's reflecting on falling out of the heavens into a world, and he's thinking about this light, and this light would be, even as you go further and further from the sun to the edge of the solar system, it doesn't ever change in the sense that it gets less, but it never becomes any the less what it is. You could have it and have it and have it, and as long as it existed at all, it would always be what it was. And then he's like, but what's behind that? Like, at the end of the solar system, is that the real darkness? And then he goes, or is there something, and the narrator says he grasps for the idea, is there something out there that is to the light of the solar system as the light of the solar system is to the, what we see as darkness here, such that this light would be like darkness to that light out there. And then he's kind of interrupted by the spaceship landing on the planet. And then later on, they're talking about the being of the Eldela, and which are these, beings that are ambiguously angelic. Lewis repeatedly denies that they're angels, but he does say that it may turn out at the end of the day that they were angels. It's not really clear. Their bodies, that they have bodies, but their bodies are made of a substance that is different to ours. It is, they're kind of made of light, and so light is a substance to them like water is to us, where they can swim in light because their bodies are made of a substance that's even more subtle than light is, and so forth. And so, there's that notion of what might spiritual embodiment look like at the angelic level. Really beautiful reflection.
Very good. Well, thank you. This has been a blessing and a delight, and safe travels as you return to your family. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Classical U podcast. Please do check out our website, classicalu.com, and our teacher magazine, Altum. We hope you've enjoyed these conversations with presenters and live learning event hosts with Classical U.